Hello learners, welcome to the 18th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century English novel, but examined through the selective prism of the work of a group of women writers. I have been discussing the life and work of Djuna Barnes. I have spent quite some time on the prefatory materials of Nightwood. I have discussed ideas of the novelist Jeanette Winterson as well as the poet T.S. Eliot. And through their ideas, I have framed the novel Nightwood as a very unique verbal artifact. It is a novel, but it is a very different novel. It is different from the kinds of experiences and texts that we come to expect from the word novel. And one thing that has come through from the comments of both of these writers, Winterson and Eliot, is that Nightwood is a novel that doesn't give us a very traditional, conventional experience. We are used to getting stories, plots, a series of dramatic or momentous events, actions concerning 2 or 3 familiar characters. So we don't actually get a very clear idea of a plot from Nightwood. It's not that things don't happen. Things happen, and it would be very easy for a novel by a different writer to describe those same events which are described in Nightwood and to create an experience of reading about them which would be similar to what we understand as novels. So we would expect verisimilitude, realism, a sort of mimetic description of things as we expect to perceive them when we read about other people's lives. We all have very clear ideas of what novels do, and we also have very clear ideas of why we value them. We value novels because they allow us an insight into the lives of other people. There is something voyeuristic. We condone the violation of privacy when it comes to the lives of fictional characters. All this is allowed because it allows us an experience which gives us pleasure, the experience of reading about the lives of fictional characters. In addition to pleasure, it also gives us a sort of intellectual, moral erudition. So reading a novel is not just an escapist pleasure, it is also an act of self-edification. So with all this said, we have very clear ideas of what to expect when we read a novel. And those ideas, those expectations are shattered almost completely when we encounter Nightwood. Why is that? I won't spend too much time on this, but I'll just say that Nightwood is an experience that can be described as approximating the purest possible definition of language. We experience language when we read Nightwood. Another way of describing the experience of this novel is to say that it is not so much a description of life, rather it is an account of what it might feel like to describe life. Or even better, it is an account of what it feels like to perceive and to prepare to write about the experiences that we call life. What does all this mean? It means that we read about things that happen to people, but there is no straightforward connection between the events about which we are reading and the moral, intellectual, or narratological value of those events. In other words, there are multiple significances that can be drawn from the events that the novel describes. And depending on who we are, where we are situated, what kinds of experiences we've had, the significance that we attribute to those events and those people vary accordingly. Which is all to say that this is an extremely rich text, and in the limited time that I have in this course, I will not be able to, in fact, I won't even be trying to provide an understanding or an interpretation that resembles something like a mastery over the text. That is a kind of reading that one can do of a traditional novel. And in fact, my lectures on passing might have approximated that kind of an approach. That is to say, I can talk about the introductory chapter and the concluding chapter, for instance, and say that here is the significance of these chapters. That kind of an approach will have less to say or will be less profitable if we take it in order to understand Nightwood. My recommendation and my very strong request to everyone taking this course is to set aside some time and to just read Nightwood. One reading will not be enough. In fact, I have spent the past few days rereading several chapters from it. And in fact, some chapters I have read more than 4 to 5 times. And every time I read these chapters, I find new things. I find that what I thought earlier was the most significant thing in this chapter, I reassess my view and I find that something else more important, more significant, more worth thinking about, more worthy of the label of the controlling idea, the protagonist, the theme, I find when I read the same chapter again. So the goal is not to interpret once and for all Nightwood. The goal is to try and open up some avenues to clear a space from where an interpretation of this very, very complex text can begin. Also, a word about complexity. Nightwood is not complex in the way that a mathematical or a scientific equation or theorem may be said to be complex. It is not a mystery. In fact, the language flows extremely smoothly and it can be understood perfectly in one reading. Rather, the complexity of Nightwood is something that is extremely pleasurable. So that adds to our experience of understanding what this text is. It flows like life. As we live and as we grow old, we keep thinking about Nightwood and the text evolves, the meaning changes and it evolves. So it very closely resembles the experience of life itself. Now, all this said, I will try and make some objective or resembling comments about Nightwood. So, since we are studying it as a novel, let us try and delineate the various aspects of this novel. So, who are the characters? Who are the people about whom we read and whom we meet in the pages of Nightwood? There is Felix Volkbein, who is a baron. He's a baron in name, but he's also a bit of a counterfeit baron. Then there's Dr. Matthew O'Connor, who's factually and objectively speaking, a medical student, sometimes a doctor. He's also getting old. That's also something that's mentioned a few times. This character has the best lines in the novel and can be said to come close, not entirely, but come close to the perspective of the author or the narrator. Although that's also a very difficult statement to make because there are several characters who at different times take on that view. But given the number of monologues that Matthew O'Connor is given, this character comes very close to representing the author or the narrator's view. Then there's Nora Flood, who works with the circus and who can be said to be a publicist. And there's Robin Vogt, who's Felix's wife and who later leaves Felix and lives with Nora and has a very intense and very powerful relationship with Nora. Then there's Jenny Petherbridge, who's a wealthy multiple widow. And then there's Guido Volkbein, who's Felix and Robin's son. Now, with this set of characters, I won't summarize the plot at this stage because I want to go over some key moments in the novel before I give a summary style version of the plot. It's important to separate summary style versions of plot from immersion and immersive experiences of reading the opening pages of the novel. Because what the plot is at the level of information means very little from what the plot feels like or is experienced as when we read the actual words of the novel. So, with that said, I want to focus at great length and with a great deal of close and minute attention on the first few chapters of the novel. So, this lecture and one or two subsequent lectures will go very deep and take a very minute and zoomed in view of the first few chapters of the novel. We will not focus on the plot of the novel as a whole. I will return to that after this zoomed in view. I will provide that wide angle view only after a very close reading and commentary of these first few chapters. And then I will end our discussion of Nightwood. I will not provide that detailed commentary for all chapters. The goal is to establish some parameters, to establish a style of paying attention. This is a phrase that I get from the scholar Vidyan Ravindran, who is a poet and a scholar of poetry, who's at Harvard now, I think. And in his essay, The Aesthetics of Indian Poetry, Vidyan Ravindran writes that scholars of poetry need to develop a new style of paying attention. And that is exactly what we need. This novel is trying to teach us how to perceive life. And in order to understand that, in order to be able to take that lesson, we need to be able to first develop a style of paying attention. So hopefully this lecture and the subsequent lecture, through my close commentary of the first few chapters, will help establish that style. So chapter 1 is titled Bow Down. The very word, the very phrase bow down with its two words gives us a hint as to the many ways in which we can interpret this language. Bow down can be either of two ways in which we can interpret this phrase. The first is an imperative command, someone asking someone else to do something. So bow down meaning the person who is saying these words is asking someone else, who is the addressee of these words, to do something, which is to bow down, to submit to authority, to accept that one person has less power than others. It is a violent expression of an unequal division of power. That is one way to read it. Another way to read it, and this is exactly what the novel teaches us with these phrases, the first word bow can also mean a bow, which is used in a lot of elaborate fabrics. So it's a little design, it's a little accessory that is often stitched onto many traditional clothing. So the fact that the bow is down means that clothing, which once signified a great deal of cultural authority or social prestige, no longer carries that value. So the appearance of social prestige, the appearance of cultural capital is revealed to be just that. It is an appearance. And the second meaning will take on direct relevance in the chapter when we find that this man, Guido has been trying to build this image of himself as an aristocrat in Catholic-dominated Europe by using the clothing, the paintings, the sculpture, the culture, and all kinds of accessories that were designed to describe and celebrate the glories of Catholic monarchy. But no one knows that those were actually not created for Guido's family. In fact, Guido will claim that he has in his possession cultural artifacts which establish him as the inheritor of a Catholic monarchy. And therefore, he calls himself a baron. But no one knows that he has actually picked up these cultural artifacts, abandoned or discarded in different places of Europe. And so, bow down means that whatever the status of the bow or whatever the status of the insignia or the accessories which signify royalty, they can be redeployed in different contexts. So that is one meaning. Another meaning of the unequal power distribution that is very obviously relevant because Guido is actually a Jew and comes from a family of Jews. And these are individuals who, in extremely hostile social context, decided to reinvent a past. So, the first chapter is a description of the lives of Hedwig and Guido Volkbein. Volkbein is a fictional word that's created by Djuna Barnes to signal Austrian and German origin, but it also signifies the spurious nature of the kind of aristocrats that Guido and, by extension, his son Felix are. And it's not just that these two individuals are pseudo aristocrats, rather, the comment is about the spurious nature of aristocracy itself. So, this is a comment on how aristocracy likes to claim that it has divine sanction for the infliction of violence, but in fact, it is always a very arbitrary and political decision. Now, there's a description of anti Semitism in Catholic Europe, and one response to this widespread and deep anti Semitism is that Guido Volkbein fashions a past for himself. The story that he creates, in the story, he emerges as the inheritor of a long and illustrious line of aristocratic, Catholic, and Christian royalty. And he creates this by appropriating the signs and symbols of shame and reinterpreting them as signs of hope and agency. So I'm going to read from page 17 of the Faber and Faber edition. The narrator writes, "Childless at 59, Guido had prepared out of his own heart for his coming child a heart, fashioned on his own preoccupation, the remorseless homage to nobility, the genuflection the hunted body makes from muscular contraction, going down before the impending and inaccessible, as before a great heat. It had made Guido, as it was to make his son, heavy with impermissible blood." So already you can see the brilliance and the way the language glows and shines and shimmers off the page almost. The first thing to note in the opening sentence is the repetition of the word heart. There are indeed two hearts. These two hearts refer obviously to the act of raising another human being, the act of nurturing and caring for another human being, but also it refers to the change in oneself, the heart that is oppressed and the heart that oppresses, or rather, the heart that learns to oppress from the oppression that itself has suffered. In a way, that explains, or that is the story of Guido and Felix's attraction to royalty and aristocracy. Felix, of course, will have a very different trajectory, but this is the narrative and this is the legacy that Guido leaves for Felix. Right? And the next very powerful structure is that of the genuflection made by the hunted body. Right? So, who is the hunted body? The Jew is the hunted body. And from muscular contraction, because the Jews were oppressed and persecuted for so many centuries, it led to one kind of contraction, muscular contraction. So the metaphor here is that if a hunted body, or if a human or an animal body is constantly forced to live in fear, then certain muscles start to contract. But the metaphor here takes this muscular contraction and from it tells a story of an emotional stance. Guido has created an identity for himself. This is the result of a muscular contraction, right? And Felix, we are told, is heavy with impermissible blood. Right? Again, a very, very powerful expression. Blood is impermissible. Right? Theories of race, theories of racial segregation and discrimination, as we discussed in the context of early 20th century America, so in the context of early modern Europe, they all had these ideas of blood being pure and impure. And in the case of early modern Europe, it was understood that the blood that flowed in the bodies of Jewish people was somehow less pure than that of Catholic or Christian souls. So, despite this perception of impurity, of something being impermissible, we are told that Felix inherits this claim to royalty, nobility, and aristocracy. So, what has Guido done? The narrator writes, "In life, he had done everything to span the impossible gap. The saddest and most futile gesture of all had been his pretense to a barony. He had adopted the sign of the cross. He had said that he was an Austrian of an old, almost extinct line, producing to uphold his story the most amazing and inaccurate proofs, a coat of arms that he had no right to, and a list of progenitors who had never existed." And so this is the story that Guido tells everyone around him, including his wife Hedwig. He reminds everyone and he shows them little trinkets, little accessories like black and yellow handkerchiefs, and he interprets these as evidence that he came from a family which had a branch in ancient Rome. So this is one way in which the muscular contraction of the persecution of Jews enables Guido to create a new identity. So what does Guido do further? We are told now. In the Vienna of Volkbein's day, there were few trades that welcomed Jews, yet somehow he, that is Guido, had managed by various deals in household goods, by discreet buying of old masters and first editions, and by money changing, to secure for Hedwig a house in a city to the north overlooking the Prater, a house that, large, dark, and imposing, became a fantastic museum of their encounter. And then there is a long description of the interior materiality of this house. And this is the first of many repeated and detailed descriptions of the interiors of many houses. This is an important theme for Djuna Barnes. Several houses across history and geography we will be placed in as readers. There will be the restaurants and cafes in Paris. There will be the house that Nora Flood has in America. There will be the houses that Nora and Robin live in different parts of the world. And in each of these moments, we will be given a very vivid picture of what it feels like to live in these houses. That is, what are the materials that surround and populate these houses, but also what is the psychological implication of these materials, of these interiors, on the people who live in these houses. So we are told, for instance, that there were 3 massive pianos and that Hedwig had played the waltzes of her time. And again, despite being a woman, she played with the masterly stroke of a man. And we are told that she played them in the tempo of her blood, that is rapid and rising, and so on and so forth. We are also told that they had a very rich and elaborate life. And into this life that was quite elaborate and fashioned in the image of aristocracy, we are told that there was something that produced a great deal of embarrassment. And we are given the first insight into the psychology of who Felix is. And the first line, in fact, before we even get any insight into his psychology, Felix enters the novel on page 21. And the first sentence which introduces Felix is actually important for us to think about, not just for understanding Felix, but also for understanding the dynamics and the characters in the rest of the novel. Here is how Felix enters the novel. At this point, exact history stopped for Felix, who 30 years later turned up in the world with these facts, the 2 portraits, and nothing more. His aunt, combing her long braids with an amber comb, told him what she knew, and this had been her only knowledge of his past. What had formed Felix from the date of his birth to his coming to 30 was unknown to the world, for the step of the wandering Jew is in every son. So several ideas to be unpacked here. The first is the sentence, that is, at this point, exact history stopped for Felix. So exact history, we are told, is not important for Felix, and there is something of the wandering Jew in every son. That is, the Jew who is persecuted, the Jew who doesn't have a home, the Jew who wanders. There is something of that. It is universalized. The experience of persecution is generalized and is transformed from something that a few people experienced at a selected time and at a selected place, that is now made into an aspect of the universal human condition. And the narrator explains what is it that we can find, which is a feature of the wandering Jew, however, we can find in every son. No matter where and when you meet him, you feel that he has come from some place. No matter from what place he has come, some country that he has devoured rather than resided in, some secret land that he has been nourished on but cannot inherit. For the Jew seems to be everywhere from nowhere. When Felix's name was mentioned, 3 or more persons would swear to having seen him the week before in 3 different countries simultaneously. Now, this is both a description of a real experience of social disenfranchisement, but also an ironic and satirical take on the experience of that social disenfranchisement. The voice of the narrator mimics some of that anti-Semitism. The description of a Jew being everywhere, and that people would swear to having seen Felix in 3 different countries simultaneously. Here, the narrator is appropriating the different voices of anti-Semitic discourse and inviting the reader to see the hypocrisy and to see through the semblance of objectivity in these descriptions. I will read from Felix's description before ending this lecture. Felix, narrator tells us, called himself Baron Volkbein as his father had done before him. How Felix lived, how he came by his money. He knew figures as a dog knows the covey, and as indefatigably he ran and pointed. How he mastered 7 languages and served that knowledge well, no one knew. Many people were familiar with his figure and face. He was not popular, though the posthumous acclaim meted out to his father secured from his acquaintances the semicircular stare of those who, unwilling to greet with earthly equality, nevertheless give to the living branch the slight bend of the head, a reminiscent pardon for future apprehension, a bow very common to us when in the presence of this people. So we are told that even though monarchy and aristocracy were not truly respected, that is, people were not willing to give Felix, despite being a baron, the dignity that he deserved, still, because he used the word baron, he managed to get something. He managed to get at least the appearance of earthly equality. And that's the meaning of this phrase. The posthumous acclaim meted out to his father, secured from his acquaintances, the semicircular stare of those who, unwilling to greet with earthly equality, right? Even though they did not respect his father as much as they should when he was alive, they felt compelled in some way to compensate or to give a version of that respect to the living branch, right? That is, earthly dignity and earthly equality and living branch. And so this was the arrangement, this was the situation. Felix went through life enjoying this kind of respect. And now, at this point, the narrator tells us that Felix began to encounter something akin to discomfort. And I will call that a combination of shame and pride, which will shape his behavior. And this will also inspire the development that we will see later, which is his interaction and his decision to situate himself, to embed himself within a group of misfits. We will explore that part of the novel in the next lecture. Thank you.